I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. This is the Book Review Podcast, and we're back. We took the last few weeks of summer off. Hopefully you had some time off as well. I got to visit The Mount, which is Edith Wharton's house in the Berkshires, which was stately and beautiful and wonderful, and I bought some Edith Wharton books there. I also went to an amazing bookstore called Shaker Mill Books in West Stockbridge, which I had visited years ago after I saw some classical music at Tanglewood, and I've been thinking about the store for years, and I got back, and it was great, and I, of course, bought way too many things. It's September now, and the podcast is back, school is in full swing, and it's time to get serious. On today's episode, we discuss some books you should be looking out for this month, and then, after the break, Stephen King joins us to talk about his new book, Holly, which is a suspense novel starring what has quickly become one of his most recurring characters, the private investigator, Holly Gibney. But first, Joumana Khatib, an editor at the Book Review, will run through some exciting September releases. Joumana Khatib, thank you so much for coming on the Book Review Podcast, as you often do, to talk about books that are coming out in the month ahead.
Hi, Gilbert. It's always nice to be here. Can't believe it's already been a month.
It has been exactly a month. We're going to bring you back every month.
Oh, right.
Yeah, you're on the hook. What are you here to talk about today? It's fall, which means that there are a ton of big books coming out. October's a big month. September is also a big one. And you are going to start with one of the biggest. Absolutely.
Yeah, I keep telling I'm repurposing a phrase I hear lobbed about athletes a lot, which is that it's a marathon, not a sprint. So keep that in the back of your mind as you're planning your fall reading, because September, October, November is very exciting. So let's start today with The Fraud by Zadie Smith. You might know her from her previous books. White Teeth was her debut. She's also written Swing Time and Northwest, and she writes criticism. And this is really exciting because this is her first ever historical novel. So it's 1860s London. She has written this amazing character who's a Scottish widow named Mrs. Touchet. And she's living in her cousin's home. She's a housekeeper, gatekeeper for her cousin, who's a novelist with a tremendously fragile ego. This is great reading, truly great reading. He has a fragile ego. He can't stop writing. His books are pretty bad. He has like a love-hate relationship with Charles Dickens. And Mrs. Touchet she watches this with some wry humor. And she's got an incredible interior life. So outside of the house, London is captivated by this trial that's going on. And the book is based on a real life trial, or it's inspired by some real life events. So there is a case where the heir to a fabulous fortune has disappeared, but somebody has come forward claiming to be the man who can lay claim to this estate. It's pretty obvious that he's like a total charlatan. He's Australian. He has none of the aristocratic trappings that you would expect, but he actually has inspired like a swath of people who really believe him. And so it becomes this sort of like populist versus aristocratic kind of battle over truth and stuff. I know this sounds heavy-handed. The book is a total romp, and it's a lot of fun. And actually, we have a colleague who's listening to it. Zadie's reading it herself and says that it's a very multivocal, very fun reading experience.
The novelist Karan Mahajan reviewed The Fraud for us, and they wrote, quote, "More so than any other novel Smith has written, this is a book about novelists, and it is in lambasting the egos of male writers that Smith has the most fun." And I've only read the first 100 pages or so, but it is one of the most enjoyable parts of the novel so far. I know writers write about writers all the time, but she does it very well.
Yeah, she's making ego kebabs, right? It's hilarious.
Delicious. So that is The Fraud by Zadie Smith. The next book is one of the biggest nonfiction releases of the entire season.
Yes, this is a hotly anticipated biography of Elon Musk by Walter Isaacson. He tends to take these big swings in his biographies. He's taken up Steve Jobs, Leonardo da Vinci. He's really fascinated by creators and innovators, and this is something that really guides him. He's a longtime journalist, and he spent 2 years trailing Elon Musk, was in meetings, getting text messages at 4:44 in the morning from Musk. Seems to really have some insight into his mind, what makes him tick. So this has been a pretty tightly sealed book. There hasn't been a lot of dribble coming out. So I don't know what's going to be in this. I don't know what kind of news there might be. But some of the things that we know from Isaacson, for example, Elon Musk really likes military history and applies a lot of military tactics to how he runs his businesses. Talks about Napoleon, all that stuff. So I think for those of us who are looking for a more sketched out or cogent portrait of who Musk is and what drives him, this is going to be the book.
The New Yorker recently ran a very long piece by Ronan Farrow about Elon Musk, in which Farrow sort of writes about the ways in which Elon has essentially become like a main source of power around the world that's divorced from any state. He's the richest man in the world. His satellites are used in the Ukrainian war, and if, according to this article at least, if he had decided to turn off the use of those satellites, the Ukrainian war effort would have been severely hindered. He is larger than life. He's a fascinating man. As you rightly point out, Walter Isaacson has written about Steve Jobs, Leonardo da Vinci, Einstein. I don't know if we're saying that Elon Musk is on the same level as all those people, but he definitely is one of the most interesting, that's value neutral, I feel like, but interesting people around now. And as we know, Walter Isaacson is very capable of taking on some of the biggest names in history. So this is going to be a big one, both literally. I think it is a long book. How long is this book? I'm looking up how long this book is. It is almost 700 pages.
Ooh.
Was that like a week? I can read
a
that in a week.
Vacation week.
Can you read that in a week?
Yeah.
Okay.
Depends on the margins. Yeah.
We'll hold each other to this. So that is Elon Musk by Walter Isaacson. Let us go to a book that has been around for centuries.
Yes, we have a fresh translation of the Iliad by Homer, his epic poem. This is done by Emily Wilson, who is a classicist. She really made waves with her previous translation of the Odyssey back in 2017. She is somebody who is, I think all translators are, but she's so deliberative about her word choice. She really frets over meaning and how to bring this into a fresh contemporary English. She strives to match the original rhythm of the poem and keep the rhyme scheme as well, because she wants to replicate the experience of hearing it spoken aloud, which is how these stories were really transmitted. And certainly with the Iliad, and her work, she's benefiting from decades and decades of scholarship about the real meaning of the original Greek, and she brings that to bear. And I don't know, I love the idea of people across America waking up and saying, honey, new Homer just dropped. That seems like a beautiful world to me.
That is a very specific scenario. I'm fascinated by the fact that is what is in your mind. Listeners of the Book Review podcast might remember Emily Wilson because on our episode about our translation issue, we talked about a piece that she did in which she compared several of the same translations of a passage from the Iliad to the one that she has now put out. I don't imagine I've read the Iliad since college, high school, college.
Be good to see what's changed.
The next book is about something I know nothing about. There's a book that's coming out. It's called Glossy, Ambition, Beauty, and the Inside Story of Emily Weiss's Glossier. This is by Marissa Meltzer. I'm a know-nothing. Tell me about this.
So this is a brand that has certainly me, my contemporaries, my loved ones in a chokehold. This is a very important beauty brand, probably the most important beauty brand for people now. It started as a blog that Emily Weiss started called Into the Gloss, where she would literally just interview people like Karlie Kloss and cultural figures about their beauty routines. And it developed a cult following. And Emily Weiss always, I think, had bigger ambitions for this. She's In the book, Marissa Meltzer, who's a very well-established and thorough business journalist, has spent years with Emily Weiss, knows her in and out, and gives a portrait of somebody who has a lot of self-possession, has a lot of drive and ambition, and she always knew that she wanted to make this into a much bigger company. It was never going to just be a blog. It was going to be kind of an empire. So eventually she started Glossier, which is a skincare and beauty brand. Some of its products are sort of like one name monikers, household names, right? The Solid Perfume, Bomb.com. But what's interesting about this is that Marissa Meltzer is really canny about peeling back the different aspects that went into building this business that makes it loom so large in our imagination, right? So, for example, Emily Weiss grew up in a pretty affluent family in Connecticut, and she zeroes in on how Emily perceived herself in high school, right? Where she's conventionally attractive and polished and poised, but while all of her classmates were wearing J. Crew and Abercrombie, she was wearing vintage and Bakelite bangles to homecoming, and always felt that she had a little bit of an outsiderness to her. And that is central to how Emily thinks of herself.
Should I read this?
Yeah, yes.
I don't even use lotion on my face.
I think this will change you. I don't know that you're going to get the rose mist setting spray, but it might get you to reconsider some little things.
I know a lot about a lot, but this is literally gibberish. I'm happy you're introducing me to this.
I swear this is actual English.
Okay.
As far as I know.
All right. That's Glossy by Marissa Meltzer. There is a second novel that several of us on the book review have read called Land of Milk and Honey. What is this one about?
Land of Milk and Honey. This is a second novel by C-Pam Zhang. It's an interesting mix. It's a climate change book because there's a smog covering the world that has blighted crops and really changed life as we know it. And our guide is a young chef. She's casting about, trying to figure out how do you cook or how do you find pleasure in food when most people are getting nutrients from something that looks like Soylent. She's pretty rootless. She's casting about. So she gets swept up into this almost Edenic mountaintop colony for very wealthy people where they're doing something very different. It's this charismatic founder and his daughter. They're wooing investors. They're using food as a way to really bring them in. And then it becomes this kind of mythic journey. It's an interesting book because the author is dealing a lot with end of times, end of the world stuff, but she also really lingers in these very individual moments, like the taste of strawberries or truffle oil, or really trying to ground you, the reader, in what it's like to take pleasure in food and these sensations.
It definitely made me realize I probably don't take enough pleasure from food, the way that the author writes about. And again, this is a world in which food, fruits, vegetables, meats have largely gone away because of this giant smog. And so when she goes to this mountaintop Eden, as you put it, she's overwhelmed by the things that she used to know. Strawberries, cream, steak.
Right. And she cannot take it. Her body physically cannot take it anymore.
It's a beautifully written book.
Yeah. And now every time I pay $18 for strawberries at the food co-op, I think I'm looking into the future.
Our last book, Joumana, is a big, meaty piece of nonfiction that has contemporary resonance. It is a book called American Gun, The True Story of the AR-15.
This is a biography of a gun that we see used in many mass shootings. This is written by two Wall Street Journal reporters, Cameron McWhirter and Zusha Ellenson. And the book opens with a minute-by-minute lead up to the 2017 mass shooting in Las Vegas, which is to date the most deadly shooting in the States. 58 people died, hundreds injured. They put you in the mind of the perpetrator, all the thought that went into carrying this out. And then very quickly, they take you back to the origin of this gun. And they make the point, this was something that was invented by a family man. He wanted to help the U.S. military better be able to take out communists. It's 1950s California. They are giving a very detailed account of how the gun's application has changed so vastly from how its creator intended it. And certainly after the patent expired in the late 70s, then it was open to all sorts of new uses and interpretations by people who wanted to monetize it. They keep a very even hand, even though this is a very emotional topic.
So that is American Gun, the true story of the AR-15. It's a little bit of a dour note to end on, but I think it's going to be a pretty interesting book that I certainly plan on reading it. Joumana, those are just 6 of the books that you can find in our article, 16 Books to Read in September. We release these previews every month. Very quickly, some of the other big books that are coming out this month are Stephen King's latest, and we'll be talking to Stephen King later on the podcast. There is a new book by Lauren Groff called The Vaster Wilds. There's a new book by Nathan Hill, who's the author of The Knicks, called Wellness. There's a new novel by one of our regular contributors, Ayanna Mathis. You might know her from her essays in the New York Times Book Review or her novel, The 12 Tribes of Hattie. Her latest is called The Unsettled. There's just a ton of stuff coming out in September.
Buckle up.
October's just around the corner. These are just 6 of them. Joumana, thank you so much for coming on, as you always do, to talk about great books.
Thanks for having me, Gilbert.
Welcome back. This is the Book Review Podcast, and I'm Gilbert Cruz. I'm joined now by an author familiar to all, and one who, lucky for us, continues to review a book about every year for us here at the Book Review. This summer, he wrote about S.A. Cosby's All the Sinners Bleed. His name is Stephen King, and he has a new novel, Holly, out now. Stephen, thanks for being here today on the Book Review Podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So, Steve, I don't want to inadvertently say too much about the book. You know how people are about spoilers and stuff. So I'm wondering if you could tell our listeners what your new book, Holly, is about.
It's about a woman who comes to Holly Gibney, who is a private detective, to look for her missing daughter. And in between the sections where Holly investigates this case, you see some of the other people who have been taken by, and I don't think this is a spoiler because it's pretty clear from the beginning, by a couple of fairly insane academics who are named Rodney and Emily Harris, who live in the cloistered halls, faculty area, very nice faculty area of the city. Holly is investigating, and in the meantime, we're getting the background of what these people did.
This is the 6th appearance by Holly Gibney. She was introduced in Mr. Mercedes alongside your retired detective, Bill Hodges. She was in that trilogy of books. Then she popped up in The Outsider, a very good book that you wrote. She was in the novella If It Bleeds, and now she's here. When did you know that Holly Gibney was going to be with you for a while?
I think that I knew that Holly was going to be an important character. When she showed up, I thought that she was a walk-on, that she was just this scared little mousy woman who wasn't going to do anything or be anybody. And it turned out that she was pretty good with computers. And there's a scene in Mr. Mercedes, the first book, where Holly shows up at a house where Jerome Robinson, who is one of Holly's friends, surrogate son almost, is there, and they connect in a way that's really sort of interesting. And she turns into a major character. And I never know where I'm going to go or what's going to happen. So I was delighted to see her show up and become an important character who grows beyond herself, the woman that we meet when we first meet her. So she was very cool, and I wanted to use her again. And so in the other books in the trilogy, I had no idea that this was going to be a trilogy to begin with. There's Mr. Mercedes, there's Finders, Keepers, and there's End of Watch. And in each one of those books, Holly becomes more important, more pivotal to those things. And again, I had no idea she was going to show up in The Outsider, but she did. And she really, at that point, starts to be somebody who has agency on her own part.
What is it specifically about her? What makes Holly, and why is that so delightful to write?
She's got a lot of bells and whistles. One of the things in the new book, Holly, it's set in the year of COVID, and Holly is very careful to always bump elbows with people. She doesn't want to shake hands. She carries around gloves in her pockets of her cargo pants, nitrile gloves. And at the same time, she's a smoker. So she has this one habit that runs contrary to the other ones. But she's a person who had a childhood where she was controlled by her mother. She was an outsider herself. She was made fun of in high school. She had a situation with a boss early on where she was sexually abused and finally stands up for herself, which is a key moment, really. She says no. Finally, she gets the courage up to say, no, I won't unbutton my blouse. No, I won't let you do what you want with me. I'm my own person. So it was interesting to see her grow. And at the same time, I love her because she's careful to always say frack instead of fuck. She's always careful to say poop instead of shit, because it's all that childhood stuff. And she's an OCD person. I'm an OCD person. I can relate. So at the same time, been able to take control of this private detective agency and going along with all her insecurities and her sense of just not being able to ever quite do the right thing. She always hears the voice of her mother, but she's also extremely smart, and she's got a deductive power that rivals Sherlock Holmes. So she's an interesting character.
You've said many times that you don't really know the ending of a book when you start it. And in your book on writing, you say, and there's a quote, "I won't try to convince you that I've never plotted any more than I'd try to convince you that I've never told the lie, but I do both as infrequently as possible. I distrust plot for two reasons. First, because our lives are largely plotless, and second, because I believe plotting and the spontaneity of real creation aren't compatible." I'm curious as to how you square that with the writing of, as you've done increasingly over the past many years, crime novels, suspense novels, mystery stories, in which historically, traditionally, there's often an overemphasis on plot.
I think that it helps to have written books that are like the talented Mr. Ripley. I loved everything Patricia Highsmith did. And there was never a question of who did what in those books. With an Agatha Christie book, I don't understand how Agatha Christie did what she did. I love the books. I was gobsmacked by the end of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. I was gobsmacked by the end of And Then There Were None. Also, what's the one where everybody on the train did it?
We just showed the movie version of this to my son, Murder on the Orient Express.
Murder on the Orient Express. Fantastic idea. I could never do that. But if you start with, you know what's going to happen, or you know who the bad person is, you don't know what's going to happen. Who is the doer of that? It's, to me, I'm not interested in the mystery so much as I am the suspense element of the story. Alfred Hitchcock said, if a bomb explodes where people are having a meeting, you have 5 seconds of horror. But if you know the bomb is under the table and they don't, then you have 10 minutes of suspense, hopefully excruciating suspense. And he was the master of that. I like that kind of story. But I will say that with Holly, there were plot elements involved with that. that drove me absolutely crazy. And I'm working on a novel now called We Think Not, which features Holly Gibney, not probably in a starring role, but she's very much an important character. And that novel is so plotted that I just want to scream. I like situations, okay? I don't necessarily like plot, and they're very different.
Have there been other books that you've worked on in which you felt at the beginning that you were over-plotting and it turned out to be unsatisfying for that reason?
I can't think of any right offhand. I can think of sections where I was stuck because I got myself painted into a corner. I can remember in The Stand, I thought to myself, I have too many characters doing too many things. What am I going to do about that? And in some ways, I have the same problem with the current book. And I remembered something that Raymond Chandler said. He said, when you don't know what to do next, bring on the man with the gun. So in my problem with the Stand, I had characters plant a bomb, and a good many of the characters that I was worried about just blew up.
I mentioned On Writing, which is your book from 2000. That's part memoir, part manual for how to think about the act of writing. And I think it's become one of your most beloved books. It's certainly one of your most beloved of the past quarter century. It's constantly on lists of great books about writing. How do you look back upon that book now? Because you have this part that says you can't be a writer if you're not a reader, but you also have this part of the book in which you had to reveal yourself, this memoir part.
The memoir part of it happened, I think, because I had an accident, quite a serious accident, while I was walking by the side of the road. I got hit by a car. And it seemed to me that became an integral part of the book, where you say to yourself, and I've always said this, that writing is partially an escape valve, but it's also a way of understanding what's going on in your life and what's going on in a particular story. Those things are part of the reason to write at all, I think. I always say that, and I think that this is in the book too, that if you spend a long time working on a book, if you spend months and months, maybe years and years, if you're some writers, Donna Tartt is a good example, someone who writes wonderful books, but she takes a long time to do those books. And so when you finish, I don't think you should think a lot about the act of writing as you write, because I think that's counterproductive. But when you finish, you should be able to say to yourself, why did I spend that time? Why did I take all these hours when I could have been walking or meeting with my children or doing something else? Why did I spend this time? What's it about? What's the purpose of it? So with On Writing, one of the things that I wanted to do with the memoir part was I wanted to demonstrate, if I could, the way that narration works with a real life incident. And some of that is in 11/22/63 as well, where there are real life people involved in the story. So I wanted to find out what that meant to me.
Do you hear about On Writing often? I know you used to, back in the days of proper letter writing, you would get tons and tons of letters. It's all email now, but it seems like for college students, academics aside, for college students, for people that are learning about writing, that are still early in their reading careers, that this has become a touchstone type of book.
That's nice if it's true. And I do get letters. And a lot of times what I will get from people are books that are either self-published or sometimes published in one of the major houses, where somebody will say, you helped me. You helped me find my way to writing stories, that you opened it up. Because I think a lot of times people feel that it's too high of a mountain to climb, that the job is too difficult. And one of the things that I tried to say in On Writing is, now hold it just a minute. You know how to write. You know how to read. You can do this depending on the level of your talent. You can do it quite well. And I think that you can always find a way in if you believe that it's possible. I know that sounds Pollyanna-ish, but it's true. The other thing is, of course, there are different levels of ability and commitment to the act of writing. There are things that you can do with a little tiny bit of talent, and there's more things that you can do with a great deal of talent. There are writers that I admire. Philip Roth is one. And I say to myself sometimes, I would kill to be able to write that well, to be able to grasp that well. But I do what I can do, and that's good enough for me.
I would like to ask, I hope you don't mind me asking, it's been a year when this podcast is going to drop since the passing of your collaborator and great friend, Peter Straub. I know you have always loved to talk about him, and I wanted to ask what it was like to write books with him and how it was to know him for so long.
I just reread The Talisman, and I'm holding off on Black House, which was the other Jack Sawyer novel that we wrote, because I would like to write a third book. It was always planned to be a 3-book series, to be a trilogy about Jack Sawyer. There was going to be Jack Sawyer as a child. There was going to be Jack Sawyer as a young man, and Jack Sawyer as an older man. The way is there. We opened the door to that last book. So I'm holding off because I don't want to junk up my head with what I'm working on now. I want to finish what I'm doing and be able to come to Black House. It's like a runway, okay? You got to get up a certain amount of speed before you can take off. So I want that. But the thing about Peter was, when I reread The Talisman, I think that I was able to appreciate more just how goddamn good he was, how with the clarity of the prose, a kind of poetic quality that merged with narrative drive. I've never seen that before. I've seen writers who can put a certain amount of narrative drive in books, and I've seen writers that can write in a certain kind of poetic fashion in prose, but very rarely do the two combine. I can only think of Deliverance by James Dickey, where he's got some of that sense. But Peter was fantastic, and he's a great loss.
One of the most discussed topics of this year in the technology space, and certainly in the creative realm, is how artificial intelligence is going to affect everything, mess everything up, destroy us. It's one of the many sticking points in the negotiations between Hollywood writers who are on strike in the studios. The way that generative artificial intelligence, large language models like ChatGPT work is that they suck in a bunch of text and they learn on that, and they're essentially trained to predict and then spit out words. The more that they're trained on, the more books and the more articles they're trained on, the better hypothetically they will become. And The Atlantic recently published an article which revealed that Llama, the large language model developed by Meta, as well as some other companies, have been trained on vast numbers of copyrighted books, including yours. And you wrote a response also in The Atlantic. And I'd love it if you could tell our listeners about that response and generally how you're feeling about this relatively new technology.
You can't stop it. It's going to happen, whether you like it or whether you don't like it. The same thing was true about the internet when it came on, when people started to catch on to the whole internet vibe, if you will, in the 90s. There was something about it that was very childish and naive. There were no ads. Now you can't go anywhere. You got to kick them out of your way. But that's the way it happened. People will say social media is bad, that it's particularly bad for children, that they are the social media, everything from TikTok to Facebook, Reddit, Twitter, is just causing people to lose any kind of sense of self. The trolls are hurting people and blah, 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 all of that stuff. The same thing is true about artificial intelligence. You may not like it. You may be afraid of it, but it is going to happen. Now, whether or not I could stop having my books fed into some kind of a computer maw, if you will, I don't know. I don't know what the truth is of that. Anybody can read one of my books. All they have to do is purchase a copy. My view is that until artificial intelligence becomes real intelligence, that is with a sentient ability, a creative spark, there's nothing to worry about.
Just going back to Peter for a second, you and Peter obviously worked on The Talisman. It was optioned as a Netflix series that would be shepherded by the Duffer Brothers, or the people behind Stranger Things, which is a series that's explicitly an homage to you, to Spielberg, to tons of other people. And we now live in this phase where you have this people like the Duffer Brothers or J.J. Abrams or writers like Colson Whitehead, who has cited you many times as one of the people that got him into writing. And I'm wondering what it's like to think about you thinking about Ray Bradbury and Richard Matheson, and now having people looking at you in the same way, who are out there, they're legion out there, who say, my creative life started with the imagination that was brought to me by Stephen King.
Yeah, the Catholic Church used to say, get them while they're young, they're ours forever. And there's a lot of truth to that. And I think Holly Gibney would agree with that. She certainly still hears the voice of her mother, the way that you might hear the voice of some priest that had to do with you when you were young. And of course, I read Ray Bradbury as a kid. I read a lot of H.P. Lovecraft, although that wasn't as big an influence. Matheson and Bradbury were more because they felt modern. They were relatable to me. And it's a handed down thing. You read the people that you love, Robert Bloch, Richard Matheson, Ray Bradbury, and in some ways you pass that on, but you add your own thing to it. And then somebody passes it on, somebody gets it from me, maybe, and that's a wonderful thing.
Steve, we're at the end here, but Tina Jordan, our deputy editor who you work with when you file reviews here, said I should end this interview by asking you for just an absolute stinker of a dad joke, which apparently you like to drop on Twitter here and there. Do you have one in mind?
You don't mean a dead joke. You mean a dad joke.
A dad joke, or a dead dad joke, but mostly a dad joke.
Jeez. When you really nail me with that, I can't think of anything. Here's one I posted on Twitter. Never play poker in the zoo because there are too many cheetahs. Ba-dum-bum.
Steve King, thank you so much for appearing on the Book Review Podcast.
God, I hope I said something that made some sense.
I think you did. It's good to see you. Thanks again.
All right. Same to you. Take care.
Those were my conversations with Joumana Khatib about 6 September books to look out for, and Stephen King about his new book, Holly. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Thanks for listening.